deep thoughts, and you've read and written, and Carl Schmitt is a major, and here we are reducing it, an ox to the size of a bouillon cube, but that's television. And now I'm about to do it all over again, because from Carl Schmitt to someone who is one of your favorite thinkers and was a friend of ours, we both knew this man until his death a few years ago, René Girard. René Girard is difficult to summarize, but a central aspect of his thinking is the so-called scapegoating mechanism. In primitive societies, conflict was often resolved by sacrificing a single individual or scapegoat whose death would reunite, would calm, heal, reunite the community. We see murders like this in myth and sacrificial practices in the classical world, so forth. Okay. Once again, Peter Thiel. For Girard, there remains a denial of the founding role of violence caused by human mimesis, that is, the human desire to imitate each other, which is the source of a great deal of trouble in his thinking, and therefore a systematic underestimation of the scope of apocalyptic violence. What if mimesis, our urge to imitate each other, drives others to acquire nuclear weapons for the sake of the prestige they confer? The word that best describes this unbounded apocalyptic violence is terrorism, close quote. There's a lot there, but René Girard is in some ways addresses an aspect of human nature. Well, it's in some it's the very thing that the Enlightenment says, no, don't even think about such things, right?
Yeah, well, the Enlightenment always whitewashes violence.
That's it.
It's one of the, there are many things we can't think about under Enlightenment reason, but one is certainly violence itself. And if you go to the anthropological myth of the Enlightenment, it's the myth of the social contract. And so what happens when everybody is at everybody else's throat? What the Enlightenment says is everybody in the middle of the crisis sits down and has a nice legal chat and draws up a social contract. And that's maybe that's the founding myth, the central lie of the Enlightenment, if you will. And what Girard says, something very different must have happened. And when everybody's at everybody's throat, the violence doesn't just resolve itself, and maybe it gets channeled against a specific scapegoat, where the war of all against all becomes a war of all against one, and then somehow gets resolved, but in a very violent way. And so I think what Girard and Schmitt or Machiavelli or the Judeo-Christian inspiration all have in common is this idea that human nature is problematic, it's violent, it's it's not straightforward at all what you do with this. It's not sort of simply utopian or where we can say that everybody's fundamentally good. Where someone like Girard and Schmitt very much disagree is that Girard believes that once you describe this, it has this dissolving effect. So scapegoating violence only works if you don't understand what you're doing. And so if we say, well, we have a crisis in our village and we're going to have a witch hunt so that everybody can, get out all their negative energy and, we'll target this one elderly woman, that only works if you don't think of it as a fake psychosocial thing.
Right.
Once you think of it in those terms, it stops to work. And so there is this sense of late modernity where this unraveling has been, for Girard, an ambiguous thing. It's both a bad thing because there are these cultural institutions that were the only way we had ever had of working, and they're unraveling, but it's also inevitable. We can't somehow put the genie back into the bottle. And so the Girardian critique of Schmitt would be that somehow when Schmitt says politics is about friends and enemies, he's being so explicit. Schmitt thinks by being explicit that he's strengthening politics, but maybe it has this effect of undermining it. And this is, I think, there's elements of this that one sees in the contemporary scene in the U.S. where there's something about it that's super intense, but then also is super fake at the same time. That's sort of what people see, and it doesn't quite work when it's simply fake.
Peter Thiel, I'm quoting you again. We are at an impasse. On the one hand, we have the newer project of the Enlightenment, which perhaps always came at too high a price of self-stultification. Again, the Enlightenment looks at 3 centuries of religious warfare in Europe and says, we'll just rule those questions out of order. Stop asking them. And Peter Thiel and Carl Schmitt say, Yes, but that leads to a narrow, small life. Okay. On the other hand, we have a return to the older tradition. Now, elsewhere in your essay, you're talking about terrorism in the third world and Islamic radicalism. We have a return to the older tradition, but that return is fraught with far too much violence. That is to say, places in the world where they are asking about first things,
Right.
first principles, human nature, the nature of God, there seems to be violence involved. And so we're at an impasse. Now, soluble or insoluble?
Well, it's always easier to describe problems than to solve them. And
Right.
this is certainly a case in point. So so the impasse, if you frame this in more scientific or technological terms, the impasse is that the weapons we have, the technology is such that we could probably destroy the world many times over, and there's some point at which this sort of breaks down. Maybe World War I didn't make that much sense. People still thought it made sense pre-World War I. They still thought there was such a thing as a winnable war. Debatable in the cases of World War I and World War II, but certainly, by the time you get to, say, 1970 and you have enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world 20 times over, it just doesn't make any sense anymore. And I think I've spoken a lot in different contexts about the sort of technology stagnation that
Yes,
we've had
yes. We'll come to
in
that
the
in a
last
moment.
50 years. But sort of one way to relate the tech stagnation to this theme is that it was just not motivated anymore. If you can think of the Manhattan Project, the Apollo space program, had military motivation. Maybe the space program ended in 1975 when we had the Apollo-Soyuz docking. If we're just going to be friends, why did you have to work 80 hours a week, around the clock? And there is a certain sense in which I would like to see us accelerate technological and scientific innovation back to the rate at which these things were progressing the first half of the 20th century. But you can't motivate it by building more advanced weapon systems, and then it's not clear we found a substitute for that.
Okay. Now, you taught a course here at Stanford. I'm sticking with the impasse for a moment, because you taught a course here at Stanford last year, and I have a couple of undergraduate friends who took notes and slipped me their notes. And then I looked over the syllabus. So there's one reading that you gave the kids that fascinates me. I'm not sure you presented it quite this way, but it almost seems as though there's an underlying suggestion that it's the way out of the impasse, or it's a way out of the impasse. Now, my hopes are high, Peter. If you dash them, just let me down gently, would you please? So here's the tech. You used the 2006 address at Regensburg by Pope Benedict XVI, not the current pontiff, his predecessor, the theologian, the shy theologian, Benedict XVI. The Pope, again, this takes a little moment or two to set up, but I'm just set it up and then get out of the way and let's see what you do with it. He makes a couple of assertions. The first concerns the reasonableness of religious belief. And he quotes an exchange between a 14th century Byzantine emperor and his Muslim captors, in which the emperor tells them they're wrong to impose religion by force. Benedict XVI, in the speech, he asks, is the conviction that acting unreasonably contradicts God's nature merely a Greek idea, or is it always and intrinsically true? Modifying the first book of Genesis, the first book of the whole Bible, John, the Apostle John, begins the prologue of his gospel with the words, "In the beginning was the Logos." John thus spoke the final word on the biblical concept of God, and in this word all the often tortuous threads of biblical faith find their culmination and synthesis, close quote. All right, huge amount there, but the fundamental idea is that properly understood, faith is reasonable. It's not merely, the idea of the reasonableness of faith is not merely a cultural construct that belongs in one place or one time. It is intrinsically, faith is intrinsically reasonable. The Enlightenment got that wrong. And we need somehow or other to grasp the reasonableness of the first questions that will enable us to ask them once again. Right?
Well, this is, there's a lot that one could unpack.
I'm just going to
in
shut
all
up. I'll
this.
let you take
There's
it
a
from
lot
there.
that one can unpack in all of this. I would say that
It's fun though, isn't it?
this is a harder interview than I was expecting, Peter. Way harder than I was expecting. I think it is a little bit tricky to say both that you don't want faith to be unreasonable, you don't want it to be merely reasonable, because then you could just use reason. And so it's always a little bit of a complicated question of how you get faith and reason to work together. I'm naturally quite sympathetic to the Benedict position
right.
and approach in a lot of ways, and yet from a literary point of view, what was so fascinating about reading the Regensburg Address, where it was, he was maybe using this 14th century Byzantine emperor maybe as a mouthpiece for the pro-reason thing. We know what happened to the Byzantine Empire. It sort of fell apart shortly thereafter.
Very shortly thereafter.
And the suspicion one has is maybe the Byzantine emperor in the 14th century should not just have been making reasoned arguments, but should have also been getting some weapons and protecting himself from what was the disaster that was about to befall the Byzantine Empire. And then the thought I had in looking at the speech from the point of view of 2019 that I wonder about is, was there something about it that was somehow prophetic of something going wrong with sort of rationalist conservative Catholicism, where Benedict is just like the 14th century Byzantine emperor, and maybe, even though I'm pro-reason and I think we live in a society where people don't respect reason enough, he somehow believed in it too much, and then I'm not Catholic like you, and I always have a two-word rebuttal of Roman Catholicism to all my conservative Catholic friends. It's just Pope Francis, and there was something about.
You get to say that now. If I start on those, I just add 10,000 years to my time in purgatory.
You can just have me back on your show.
Yeah, exactly.
You can do that.
Okay.
So that's the. So it's a fascinating speech, but it can be unpacked on all these levels.
So I read the Regensburg Address in your syllabus, and I thought, Peter's offering. Here's the way out of the impasse, and you're saying, no, not exactly. I take that as a warning. Place too much faith in the reasonableness of faith or in reasonableness itself, and 10 years later, everything you stood for will be wiped out.
Well, I think we have to always try to go back to intellect, mind, rationality as core values, and there are ways in which we've gone too far from them. But at the same time, I also think there's something to be said for it can't be just interiority. We also should be, acting in our world. We should be, we shouldn't be in this sort of yoga, meditative, psychological retreat. And then there's sort of all these ways where science and technology, that were that were such a big driver of progress for centuries. There's so many parts of these that no longer feel positive to people, and that feel like a retreat. I'll give a Silicon Valley version of this. I was involved in the early 2000s in a lot of the futuristic AI initiatives.
You invested in.
There's a Singularity Institute. There were sort of all these groups, and
Right.
the basic premise was, AI is going to happen. It's going to be, if it happens, it's this very important.
AI. Hold on. You better, just for viewers, you better explain. Give us a 2-sentence definition of AI.
Yeah, it means all these different things, but the context in which they used it was sort of the science fiction version of AI. So super duper smart computers that can do anything, and they're going to be very powerful.
So smart they'll seem like humans.
Or maybe even smarter than humans.
Right.
And it's very important whether or not they're friendly or unfriendly. And this was sort of an important problem that we needed to solve. And circa 2003, it felt like, okay, we don't know which way it's going to go, and we need to work on it. And if you had to score it circa 2019, it's far more pessimistic. And people now believe they know what's going to happen at the Singularity, that the AI is going to kill every human being on this planet. That's what people actually believe. And
Including you?
Well, we can be skeptical how fast it happens, but no, that's the general zeitgeist, even in Silicon Valley.
Okay,
even in Silicon Valley.
right.
Certainly, anyone who watches a science fiction movie believes that, And
But your point is that this valley,
then-
which used to be bright and hopeful, has gone very dark.
And so maybe if you're an AI researcher, you should be working on it very, very slowly. And you're going to be somewhat less motivated to work on it. And it has a very different sort of a feel to it. And so even this sort of fairly theoretical part of computer science, it's more in the world of bits than the world of atoms, has shifted into this much more apocalyptic direction where, 2003, 2004, it was we need to move as fast as we can, and now it's sort of like the precautionary principle, and maybe we should be scared of our own shadow and just be very, very slow. And that's happened even in computer science, which was one of the healthier fields still 20 years ago.
All right. Contemporary politics, the issues of the day, China. What went wrong? Let me be a simple quotation here. The late economist and foreign policy analyst, my colleague here at the Hoover Institution, Harry Rowan. Harry Rowan, by the way, was a lovely, humane, highly intelligent man. I say that because I'm about to read a quotation from him that suggests he was just mistaken. He wasn't always mistaken. He wrote this in 1996. When will China become a democracy? The answer is around the year 2015. This prediction is based on China's steady and impressive economic growth, which in turn fits the pattern of the way in which freedom has grown in Asia and elsewhere in the world. Close quote. Economic growth was supposed to lead to democracy in China, and that wasn't madness. There was the example of South Korea. Mm-hmm. First they got rich, and then they became democratic. And of Taiwan, they got rich, and then they became democratic. And you could argue that the American foreign policy establishment has lost a quarter of a century expecting things to go right in China, and they haven't. How come?
Well, I think these things are always somewhat overdetermined, but maybe if I had to come up with a simple mistake that people made was it was way too deterministic a view of history. There's nothing automatic about the way history can happen, and it's not that you get to $8,000 per capita GDP and you automatically become a democracy. These things can go in a lot of different directions. There's a great deal of contingency, and if I had to pick on you a little bit, Peter, here, it would be that there's that speech that you helped ghostwrite or write, right. Tear down that wall, Mr. Gorbachev.
Yes.
And it was effective. And the Berlin Wall came down in '89, and communism fell in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union.
Stop there.
But we can't stop there.
We can't.
because there were other people who paid attention to this, and there were people in China and East Asia who paid attention to this, and they drew some very different lessons. And the lesson they drew was that we have to make sure that we keep the Leninist part of the state running very strongly. We can have, you can have perestroika, you can have restructuring, but you can't have glasnost. And we're going to decouple them, and we're going to learn the opposite lesson because, you open things up just a little bit too much, and things fall apart. And I think for 28 years, I'd say at least '89 to 2017, we basically in the West read the events of '89 as that was inevitably going to happen in the East, and China read them. It's not going to happen because we're going to learn from history. We're going to make sure it doesn't happen here. And the exact same events were interpreted in different ways, and they were probably not going to happen because China wasn't going to let them. And we were oblivious to this because we were just so convinced of this determinacy of history.
Right.
The riff I always have on this is that 2017, 2018 is the year that Xi became president for life, and that's the year that Fukuyama's end of history definitively came to an end. But there are all these reasons you could have said.
Right.
There was a lot of evidence earlier that things were off.
Okay. In your book, Zero to One, I'm quoting all kinds of things. At least I get high marks for doing my homework for you, Peter.
The quotes are accurate.
Okay. In your book, Zero to One, quote, China is the paradigmatic example of globalization. Its 20-year plan is to become like the United States is today, close quote. So China, this is another, I think, dated thought, but I'll let you tell me. China can only copy. It is incapable of genuine innovation on its own. And as long as the United States remains innovative, then we have the hope of remaining a step or two ahead of them. Yes?
Yes, I agree with that, but I would read it a little bit differently. So I do think that the West is still far more innovative than China. But if you're only 1 or 2 steps ahead, that's not very much. And so if things are copied very quickly, then maybe you don't need to innovate at all. You can outsource all the very hard R&D work to the West. You have a lot of deadweight economic costs associated with that. And then if you can just steal all the IP, that might even be, a more efficient way to innovate. And maybe you're 6 months behind, but you don't have to be behind that far. And so I think that's roughly the way to think of a lot of the contemporary sort of technology races. If there's innovation happening in AI, and I think most of the breakthroughs, or just about all the breakthroughs, I believe, have happened in the West, but they get transmitted to China within 6 to 12 months, and so that's the kind of
not enough
dynamic
of
we
a
have.
margin for us.
So yes, we're innovating, but it only gives you so much.
Now, you have said, actually, this is something else I have in here, but I'm not going to take the time to go back and find it, that one of the, so I'll paraphrase you instead, one of the signal accomplishments of the Trump administration is causing everybody to rethink, to reevaluate China. So Trump, we've got a number of different, what's getting all the attention is the trade policy, slapping on tariffs. The Wall Street Journal
Yes.
takes one whack at him after another's, arguing that we're harming ourselves. Bob Zellick in the Journal this morning was arguing we're doing far more harm to ourselves and our own trading partners than we are to China. Then you've also got, I believe, you'd know more about this than I, but I believe there are also stepped up intelligence efforts and stepped up enforcement efforts concerning technology transfers. Just a sort of open-ended question. How is the Trump administration doing in terms not just of waking everyone up to the danger of China, but the actual implementation of specific policy?
Well, I think this is all still very much a work in progress.
Right.
I do think that there has been a sea change on the perceptions with China, and in a way, the way I think of U.S. politics is it's badly tribal. It's too polarized. Most of the times we just have this trench warfare with the two parties fighting each other. No one makes much progress. It's when you really win on issues when you get the other side to agree with you.
Right.
And I believe that on the China issue, the Trump administration has gotten the entire center left to agree with him. I think maybe Biden is still the one pro-China candidate running, and that seems like a catastrophic albatross for him in the Democratic primary this year. I think all the others are probably as anti-China or as tough on China as the president is. Maybe they'll be even tougher if they get in, because to some extent the Trump administration policies are still moderated by we're trying not to hurt American businesses, and I suspect the Democrats will be less concerned about business.
Got it.
But I think there's been a sea change on that. Yes, and of course the free trade theories are correct in theory. There are all sorts of, but in the real world, this stuff is always super messy. And if you're negotiating a free trade treaty, you want the person negotiating it to be one who's not a doctrinaire free trader, because a doctrinaire free trader will believe that the worse a job they do negotiating, the better a job they're doing. Because
Right.
if even if you concede everything and you get nothing from the other side, there still are these gains from trade. And that's what free trade doctrine always tells you, that you don't need to work very hard on these trade treaties. And the U.S. is really the only country in the world that believe that. Western Europe, Japan have in effect far higher. They have barriers to trade. You have tariffs in the form of VAT taxes. 15 to 20%
sure.
across the board on goods in Western Europe, Japan, and yes, if we got rid of all that, maybe that would be a sort of more efficient world. But we've obviously gotten to a very, very unbalanced point. The other metaphor I always give on this is that the basic flow is we have $500 billion that we import from China, $100 billion a year that we export to China, and in effect $400 billion of cash flows uphill from being saved by poor Chinese peasants and being invested in low-yielding U.S. government bonds. And so if you're looking at this from outer space, that alone tells you that it's just a completely crazy regime. And that some
But what about, well, if they want their peasants to finance our government debt, why not?
well,
Right? That's the free trade argument, right?
But if we believed in globalization,
Yes.
the way globalization is supposed to work is the less developed countries are supposed to converge. They converge, they grow faster, therefore you get a higher return on investing in them, and therefore capital should be exported from the developed to the developing countries. That is the direction which capital flowed circa 1900,
Right.
when the United Kingdom had a current account surplus of 4% of GDP, and the extra capital was invested in Argentinian bonds and Russian railroads and all these different things. And the globalization ended badly in 1914, in the late 19th, 20th century, but that at least made sense.
Yes.
The money flowed in the correct direction. This time, we're in a much crazier form where the money is flowing the wrong way. That's not what Chinese peasants shouldn't be saving money in low-yielding government U.S. bonds or negatively yielding European bonds. They should be, investing in China, where they should be getting a higher return, and so should we.
All right. I want to come back to Trump in a moment, but first, sort of a summary question about China. Population of 1.3 billion, intense work ethic, the ability to deploy capital and infrastructure. Everybody says, including you have told me this, you go to China and the airports are dazzling and the trains run fast and they're clean and efficient. And of course, now they have a habit of rapid economic growth. And in the long contest to come between the United States and China, what have we got? Democracy, a free press, innovation that keeps us 6 months ahead? Are you optimistic?
Well, it's very hard to score. I would say the although my pessimist.
I'm hoping you cheer me up on this.
My neutrally pessimistic description is that if you scored it, I think both sides think they're going to lose. I think the United States thinks that it's sort of like this declining power, but China does not think it's going to win. You have a demographic collapse.
Right.
Anyone who makes money tries to get their capital out of the country. People are still, if at all possible, trying to get out of China. And so if you were to try to, psychologically score the two sides and say who believes they're going to win, actually they both think they're going to lose.
So,
even if you think you're going to win, doesn't mean you're going to win. Although I think if you think you're going to lose,
better way to go through life, though.
If you think you're going to lose, you will lose.
Right.
If you think you're going to get an A on a test, you don't always get an A. If you think you're going to get an F, you always get an F.
Right.
And so what's very confusing is I think both sides think they're going to lose.
I told a lie. One more question about China. You said a moment ago that in the 50s and 60s, a lot of the technological progress was driven in effect by the Cold War, by the military need to develop technology. Which reminds me of, again, I can't quote this, I can only paraphrase it, but there's some place in fairly early George Kennan, one of the diplomats and important writers on the Cold War, fairly early George Kennan, in which he wrote that he welcomed the long struggle to come between the United States and the Soviet Union because it would bring out the best in the United States. We had nothing to fear from this as long as we lived up to our own best traditions. He expected it to be a bracing struggle. Struggle between China and the United States help us technologically? Will it be good for our character?
Well, the Cold War, we won the Cold War, but there are a lot of different ways that could have gone. So I'm not quite sure.
You'd rather
I'm
not.
I'm not totally convinced of that. But I think, I think that the future version of I do think that the future that China represents is not a future that is particularly desirable. I was struck by this when I was in Western Europe a few months ago. That I think the future is something that always has to be thought of in relatively concrete terms, and it has to be different from the present. And only something that's different from the present and very concrete can have any sort of charismatic force. And looking at Western Europe, I would say there are basically three plausible futures on offer. Number one is Islamic Sharia law, and if you're a woman, you get to wear a burqa. Number two is totalitarian AI a la China, where the computers track you in everything you do all the time, and that's kind of creepy, sort of the Eye of Sauron, to use the Lord of the Rings reference,
Right.
watching you at all times. And then the third one is hyper-environmentalism, where you drive an e-scooter and you recycle. And even though I'm not a radical environmentalist, I think if those are the three choices, you can understand why the green movement's winning, because those are the three visions of the future we have.
Right.
And the challenge on the conservative or libertarian side is to offer something that's a picture of the future that's different from these two very dystopian and one somewhat stagnant one.
Okay. A note from a friend of mine, young friend of mine, who took, this is a note that he took in your class. So this isn't in your syllabus, it's something you said in class. If you've got economic growth, you can solve most problems. This brings us to Donald Trump. We've got economic growth. Now, the 3% seems to have cooled as we sit here talking, and maybe it's going to average out this year at something between 1.8, 2.4, something like that, but it's economic growth. Maybe we all relax?
Well, Reagan, we got 6% growth in 83, 84, 85. We got something like 6% growth almost 3 years in a row. So it's, 2 or 3% is definitely better than nothing. The question on the Trump administration is, can we keep going with this for the next decade? And I think in some ways the president will get reelected if people believe that this sort of growth is going to be sustainable for the next decade.
That's the future he offers.
And that's it. It's not quite as exciting as Reagan, but it's still 2 to 3% for a decade. Things will gradually get better. We will work our way out of a lot of these challenges, and then the concern is if it's just this temporary blip driven by too much debt, too much things like that, then
Joe
again,
Biden or Elizabeth Warren, Elizabeth Sanders. They might as well be. Bernie Warren or Elizabeth Sanders start to look okay.
the socialists are,
Right.
not to be underestimated.
Do you
There's a Marxist theory that the Marx time for communism would come when interest rates went to zero, because the 0% interest rate was a sign that the capitalists no longer had any idea what to do with their money, and therefore there were no good investments left. That's why the rates are zero, and therefore all that you could do at that point was redistribute the capital. And so it doesn't mean 0% rates lead us to socialism, but it is always something that I find it alarming that the rates are as low as they are.
Last question about Donald Trump. Do you expect to endorse him?
Yes, I certainly will not endorse any of his opponents.
All right. A couple of closing questions here. We became friends when you were still a student here at Stanford. Imagine a young Peter Thiel listening to us now. Peter Thiel himself, Stanford undergraduate, Stanford Law School, practiced law at a big fancy firm in New York for 7 months, and then said, this is horrible, came out here and began investing in tech. But now Peter Thiel himself has the Thiel Fellowships, which are to entice really bright kids to drop out of college. And you've just sat here telling us that the valley that you came back to from New York and began investing in is not the valley of today. Things have gone dark. So what path would you recommend to an 18 or 20-year-old now?
Wow, these are always such hard questions to answer, and I think even if I knew all these things, I'm not sure what I would have done. And of course, that's a fake thought experiment. The question, looking back, would be when I graduated undergraduate in 1989. What are some different choices I would have done? And I think I should have the reasonable advice I'd give my former self from 30 years ago would be something like, just think a lot harder about the future. Don't think of education as a substitute for the future. Try to think concretely what you want to do, and there's something about the sort of tracked educational system that again it gets packaged as a form of thought, but it's a substitute for thought. It's a substitute for the future, and yeah, you have to. It's you probably don't want to do the things that are hyper competitive that everybody's doing. There's and I think there's always a question. Where's the frontier? Where are there some pockets of innovation where you can do some new things and not be in a crazed competition. But that was a hard question to answer then. I think it's a harder one now, but I think it's still the right question to ask.
All right.
It's always it's always the contrarian intellectual question. Tell me something that's true that nobody
Yes.
agrees with you.
This is your favorite question.
What's a good career that other people aren't pursuing? The politically incorrect career, engineering career, is petroleum engineering.
Got it.
So it's super lucrative, and there just are, for ideological reasons, not enough people go into it.
All right.
So that's a straightforward ideological answer.
All right. So here's the last question, Peter. You're still investing, but you're teaching classes at Stanford. You're fielding telephone calls from the White House. At this stage in your life, what are you trying to accomplish? You're famous for saying having a plan. You may not follow the plan, but having a plan is better than no plan. What are you thinking over the next 5 years or 10 years for you?
Well, I don't know. This always sounds too ambitious or too grandiose. But I would like to get our society. I would like our society to get back to the future, to get back to a society that's progressing in all these important dimensions, and there's sort of a very local way of doing that, which is investing in futuristic technology companies. So that's a small, manageable way you do this, and then there's sort of our broader conversations like the one we're having today, where we try to get people to think about this topic. But it's we need to think about the future arrives. It will be different from the present, and if we don't think about it, it's much less likely to be a good future than if we work to craft it.
Pieter Thiel, thank you. For Uncommon Knowledge, the Hoover Institution, and Fox Nation,